As an island nation, Britain has depended upon its ships for trade, travel, protection and pleasure. During the past century, there have, however, been many changes. Passenger liners have given way to cruise ships, the number of British registered freighters has steadily declined, nearly all coastal excursion traffic has gone, as have many ferry crossings, whilst the Navy, although still in the world rankings, has been subject to successive cutbacks. In our first section, we look at ships from the Royal Navy, as well as some famous names from the golden age of ocean travel. One of these names still haunts us from the bottom of the Atlantic. Titanic was one of 3 sister ships built for the White Star Line by Harland and Wolff of Belfast. On her maiden voyage, this 4-funnel Leviathan struck an iceberg in April 1912, which slashed through 5 of her watertight compartments. The rest, as they say, is conjecture, accusation, and a multi-million-dollar movie. Following the tragedy, people clamoured for actual footage of the stricken liner, but as there was nothing of any significance, so film of her sister ship Olympic leaving New York was passed off as Titanic leaving Southampton. The deception was abetted by crudely scratching out the names of the New York tugs. Again, scenes filmed on board Olympic were said to be of Titanic. Interestingly, concerns having been expressed about White Star's poor safety record, the company did little to dispel the popular belief that their new ships were unsinkable. Survivors from Titanic were picked up by the 4-masted single-funnel Cunarder Carpathia. Launched in 1902, she would be one of 22 Cunard vessels sunk during the First World War. Whilst White Star traded on luxury, her great competitor Cunard preferred speed and safety. The Lusitania and Mauretania were the world's first quadruple-screw, turbine-driven merchant liners. Here the entertainer Sir Harry Lauder is seen embarking on the ill-fated Lusitania, which would, several years later, be sunk by a German U-boat with the loss of over 1,000 lives. For much of this century, British naval power has been impressive. This is the armoured cruiser HMS Powerful of 1895. The battle cruiser Lion was Admiral Jellicoe's flagship at Jutland in 1916. The Navy played a major role during the First World War and was vital for protecting the nation's trade routes. At the end of the war, all major German liners were confiscated, some coming to this country. Included was the mighty 56,000-ton Bismarck, which passed to White Star, who renamed her Majestic. Whilst the 53,000-ton Imperator launched in 1912 went to Cunard, who renamed her Berengaria. Here are some of the giants of the North Atlantic seen at Southampton docks in the mid-20s. Aquitania, Berengaria, Mauretania, Majestic, Duke of Montrose, and Homeric. By the time of the Wall Street crash in 1929, most of these vessels were past their prime. Neither White Star nor Cunard had invested in new express liners capable of seeing off the challenge from their competitors. Some British companies, believing the big liner could be a thing of the past, had purchased intermediate ships, like the 20,000-ton Samaria, which Cunard employed on their Canadian mail services. The Cunard subsidiary Anchor Line introduced their 17,000-ton Tuscania in 1921. In the late 20s, Canadian Pacific purchased 4 oil-fired Duchesses. Owing to their tendency to roll, these 20,000-tonners were known affectionately as the Drunken Duchesses. The Athol, seen departing from Liverpool, was sunk by a U-boat in October 1942. Alongside the modern Duchesses, White Star's 4 mighty Whites exuded an air of faded elegance. However, despite advancing years, they remained amongst the most profitable ships in the fleet. White Star broke the mould with Britannic, which in 1930 was the largest and most powerful motor ship in Britain. Her builders, Holland and Wolff, claiming she could move 1 ton, 1 mile on a thimbleful of oil. Reina del Pacifico was another contemporary motor vessel. Owned by the Pacific Steam Navigation Company, she sailed to the west coast of South America. During the Depression, liners such as Lamport and Holt's 13,000-ton Van Dyke found employment in the new and lucrative cruise market. By the early 30s, White Star was in serious financial difficulties. To rescue the ailing company, it was merged with Cunard in January 1934 as part of an agreement whereby the British government loaned the new company £9.5 million. Part of this money financed completion of the Queen Mary, whose keel had been laid down in 1930. When this superb 81,000-ton ship was launched from John Brown's in September 1934, it signaled to the rest of the world that Britain was emerging from the Depression. This was further emphasized when the new superliner recaptured the coveted Blue Riband of the Atlantic. Despite various costly refits, Mauretania ended her days as a cruise ship. In 1935, the Grand Old Lady of the Atlantic would finally go to the breakers. Olympic followed shortly after. Nicknamed Old Reliable because of her wartime service, she was dismantled at Jarrow in order to alleviate chronic unemployment. Her hull was then towed away for demolition to Inverkeithing. June 1939 saw the maiden voyage of a new Mauretania. Built by Camel Laird of Birkenhead, this Maury could carry over 1,100 passengers at a service speed of 23 knots. Here, the 36,000-ton liner is about to set sail from Liverpool. The keel of the world's largest liner, the 84,000-ton Queen Elizabeth, had been laid down at John Brown's in December 1936. She was launched 2 years later. But with war looming, the planned express service with the Mary on the Southampton-New York crossing had to be postponed, and the Elizabeth sailed to New York in total secrecy in February 1940. How prepared was the Navy for the Second World War? Certainly things looked impressive enough at the 1937 Spithead Review, but too many vessels were elderly and outmoded. However, reflecting contemporary thinking, more heavy battleships were being decommissioned, whilst 5 vessels had been converted to carry aircraft. In the background is an E-class destroyer. Sabre was an S-class destroyer, whilst Leander was a light cruiser. The first purpose-built carrier was Ark Royal, launched by Camel Laird in 1937. She contributed to the sinking of the Bismarck before being sunk herself in the Mediterranean. The Navy played a key role in the evacuation from Dunkirk. Many engagements captured the public imagination, none more so than the Battle of the River Plate, in which 3 British cruisers, Achilles, Ajax and Exeter, clashed with the Graf Spee. 2 days after scuttling his pocket battleship, Captain Langsdorff would commit suicide. On the other hand, Exeter returned to a hero's welcome. Here, a squadron of battleships and cruisers are captured in action. Without the convoys from North America, Britain would have been in mortal danger. As early as March 1940, 222 ships had been sunk by German U-boats. Here we see coasters under aerial attack in Dover Straits. As the war progressed, the carrier, the submarine and the mine became of supreme importance. During the war, over 2,400 Allied merchant ships would be lost. Along with other liners, both Queens served as troop ships. Painted in drab wartime grey and always maintaining radio silence, they zigzagged back and forth across the oceans of the world, carrying over 1.5 million men. Churchill declared, "The Queens helped to win the war in Europe by at least a year." Now they were back, at the forefront of an unprecedented boom for Cunard White Star, which by 1957 had 10 liners on Atlantic passenger services. The company's first post-war vessels have been 2 poor sea-boats, the intermediate passenger cargo liners Parthia and Media. When she went for scrap in 1950, the Aquitania had almost rusted away. She had crossed the Atlantic 600 times, steamed 3.5 million miles, and carried 1.25 million people, including latterly many GIs and their brides. By the end, this survivor of 2 world wars was simply worn out. Although British shipyards were at full capacity after the war, lack of supplies led to long delays. For example, a new Ark Royal laid down in the 40s was not finally commissioned until 1954. In the mid-50s, Cunard took delivery from John Brown's of 4 22,000-ton sister ships, Ivernia, Corinthia, Saxonia and Sylvania. These quads, however, would enjoy very few profitable years. Whilst undergoing a major refit in Liverpool, a mysterious fire consumed the Canadian Pacific liner Empress of Canada in January 1953. Later, it took great skill and ingenuity to raise the charred hulk. Another Empress was one of the last truly handsome liners. Launched on the Clyde as the Empress of Japan, she was, after Pearl Harbor, quickly renamed Empress of Scotland. Eventually sold to the Hamburg America line, she was renamed Hanseatic and converted into a 2-funneler before ending her days in 1966. 3 new Canadian Pacific White Empresses entered service between 1956 and 1961, just as passenger numbers were in rapid decline. The world's liners had been fatally wounded by the arrival of the commercial jet plane. Air travel would swiftly relegate these ocean monarchs to the pages of history. Royalty, statesmen, newspaper magnates, film stars, as well as members of the ordinary public deserted in their thousands as travel time dropped from days to hours. All too quickly, the queens became floating museum pieces, limping leviathans losing thousands of pounds per crossing. Sometimes they even sailed with more staff than passengers. When withdrawn in 1965, Mauretania was described as a gorgeous old girl, but slipping fast. The Mary went in 1967 after her 1001 crossing. And the Elizabeth made her last voyage from Southampton in November 1968. The reign of the old queens was over. However, the following year, a new queen was crowned. Built by the Upper Clyde shipbuilders, the 60,000-ton QE2 remains a potent symbol of Britain's one-time dominance of the North Atlantic. Now this elderly and costly liner is owned by an American shipping line and is just one of many vessels engaged in the cutthroat cruise business, a market which has expanded rapidly during the past 30 years. An old British favourite was Canberra, delivered in 1961 and withdrawn in 1977. In 1981, she formed part of the task force sent to the Falklands. Here, the 45,000-ton liner was filmed leaving Southampton in September 1982 on her first post-Falklands cruise. On the same day, the 17,000-ton British India Uganda of 1952 was also making her first cruise after serving as a hospital ship. She was withdrawn in 1985. Next we embark on a coastal voyage, calling in at selected ports with film taken at different periods during the past 100 years. We begin on the Thames, where in the 1960s the Port of London still handled the most tonnage in the country. A free vehicle ferry still crosses the river at Woolwich. However, the last of these old paddle steamers bowed out in 1963. The Thames was once a busy highway, full of seagoing vessels making their way to and from the London docks or riverside wharves. From Tilbury, now one of the country's biggest container ports, the LMS operated a ferry service to Gravesend. It was also a major embarkation point for liners owned by P&O and Orient Lines. A brief glimpse of some Thames barges. Crossing the Dover Straits can be an eerie experience in a pea souper. Shortly after entering service in 1949, the 4,000-ton Maid of Orleans was en route to Dover. Outbound from Dover to Ostend in 1957, with the former Southern Railway steamer Isle of Thanet of 1925 in the background. The English Channel is one of the most crowded and hazardous seaways in the world. Sea cats have been crossing the Channel since 1990. On a typical summer Saturday, over 200 ships can pass through the Dover Straits, whilst crossing their path is a bewildering two-way flow of over 150 ferries, hovercraft, sea cats, and other vessels, including yachts. The hovercraft, one of the most imaginative British innovations of the 20th century, was first introduced onto cross-channel routes in 1966. The new generation of cruise ships, such as the 29,000-ton Black Watch of 1972, also regularly visit Dover. This is the Pacific Princess. Sharing the bulk of the continental cargo and passenger traffic with Dover was the other railway port of Folkestone. Dating from 1918, the Maid of Orleans would act as a troop transport during the Second World War, before being mined in 1944. The French-owned Côte d'Azur was sunk in 1940, refloated by the Germans, and then lost again in 1944. The replacement Côte d'Azur of 1951 sailed from both Folkestone and Dover. Here she is about to pass the Canterbury, built in 1929 for the prestigious Golden Arrow London-Paris service. This was the first cross-channel steamer to be equipped with radar and was scrapped in 1965. Sailing from New Haven to Dieppe in the mid-30s was the elegant Worthing of 1928. After war service as HMS Brigadier, she was sold into Greek waters in 1955. Many people will have fond memories of the many pleasure steamers which once abounded along the south coast, often on crossings to and from the Isle of Wight. The 381-ton Embassy was one of the last active paddlers being broken up in 1967. She had been launched in 1911 as the Duchess of Norfolk, was eventually rebuilt and converted to oil fuel in 1946. The Sandown was built in 1934 by the Southern Railway for its well-patronised Portsmouth Ride service. Her capacity was just short of 1,000, and she ended her days in 1966. Here she carries the BR insignia on her funnel. Following nationalisation, BR had introduced Southsea and Brading, a pair of screw steamers. Each displaced 837 tons and could accommodate over 1,300 passengers. Both would be withdrawn by 1988. As the Isle of Wight is birthplace of the hovercraft, it is fitting that they operate some crossings to the island. Throughout most of this century, harbour excursions have enabled visitors to view the assembled naval vessels at Portsmouth. This trip was made in 1959 on board Ferry Bell. It offers glimpses of HMS Tiger and the salvage vessel Reclaim. Other warships were seen in reserve. Until the disappearance of the great liners, Southampton was Britain's major gateway to the New World. Crossing the Itchen were the town's unusual chain-guided floating bridges, which survived until 1977. the early 60s, there was still a wealth of different kinds of ships to be seen. The Spanish-owned Montserrat, having started life as a wartime victory ship, was later used to carry emigrants to America. This was one of the distinctive Union Castle liners. The Fairseas, built in 1957, sailed to Australasia. The Polish-owned Batory dated from 1936. This is the 24,000-ton cruise ship Northern Star. The P&O liner Iberia of 1954 was filmed in dry dock. This is the Hamburg America liner Bremen. The magnificent 37,000-ton New Amsterdam dated from 1938. This new ocean terminal, now demolished, was opened as late as 1950. More footage now of the South Coast's delightful armada of pleasure steamers. Built for the Southern Railway in 1930, Whippingham, used mainly for excursion traffic, could be seen at ports stretching from Brighton to Bournemouth. She lasted until 1962. Built on the Clyde in 1908, Bournemouth Queen survived until the end of the 1957 season. Weymouth was the principal port for the former Great Western Railway services to the Channel Islands. This is one of a pair of Clyde-built steamers dating from 1925. When originally delivered, each had 2 funnels, but the dummy was subsequently removed. The car ferry Normannia was filmed in 1975. Crossing the River Dart in the early 1960s. Over the years, the Dart often played host to the former Royal Yacht Britannia. This graceful old ship was finally decommissioned in 1997. These views were taken in the early 1960s. Perhaps no town symbolises our great naval tradition more than Plymouth. Here Drake reputedly played bowls before destroying the Spanish Armada, and then in 1941 the port was heavily bombed by the Luftwaffe. Today, despite deep defence cuts, Devonport, birthplace of so many legendary fighting ships, remains the largest naval base in Western Europe. A coaster passes the tip of Land's End and the Longship Lighthouse. The Ravenswood of 1891 represents the many paddlers once employed in the Bristol Channel. Although being much altered and having served as a minesweeper during both wars, she survived in the fleet of P.A. Campbell's White Funnel Line until 1955. Served by trains from Paddington, Fishguard is still the main port for Rosslare. The Stena Normandica is seen departing in June 1979. Crack expresses from Euston once conveyed passengers here to Holyhead. These scenes show Hibernia and Cambria. When they entered service in the late 40s, they were the largest railway-owned ferries. They were also the first to be powered by diesel engines. Cruises in the Menai Straits remained popular until the 1960s. This 100-year-old film shows some of the area's delightful Victorian paddlers, such as the St Tidno of 1891, which could carry over 1,000 passengers. Her heavy compound engines notching up a top speed of 19 knots. She would last until 1922. Built by Lairds of Birkenhead in 1892, Snowdon was much smaller, having a certificate for only 462 passengers. During the First World War, she was involved in minesweeping. The St Elwes dated from 1896. She could carry nearly 1,000 passengers and spent all her life, except for minesweeping duties during the First War, operating between Liverpool and Llandudno or Llandudno and the Isle of Man. She last ran in 1930. Eventually, these elderly paddlers gave way to vessels like the St Tidno of 1926. Powered by single reduction geared turbines, she could carry nearly 2,500 people. This fine ship would make her last sailings for the beleaguered Liverpool and North Wales Steamship Company in September 1962. Owned by the same company, the St Cyril of 1931 made her final voyage at the end of the 1961 season, by which time the motor car had all but wiped out this kind of leisure cruising. Also viewed at Llandudno, the King Orry of 1946. Built to replenish wartime losses, she was one of 5 virtually identical vessels launched from Camel Laird for the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company. Mona's Queen of 1934 had been mined at Dunkirk in 1940 and was one of several steam packet ships lost during the war. Viking, however, survived nearly 50 years. The first steam turbine ship in the Isle of Man fleet, she was converted into a seaplane carrier during the First War. Cats and kippers are synonymous with the Isle of Man. This 1939 film captures aspects of the island's herring industry. Today, strict EU regulations have had a profound effect on Britain's fishing fleets. Arguably the most elegant of all the steam packet vessels was Lady of Man. Built in 1930, this classic steamer was filmed on her last ever voyage to and from Douglas in August 1971. Listen to her magnificent triple chime steam whistle. The Irish Sea can lash itself into a fury. Manoeuvring out of Douglas Harbour with its dangerous swells and currents then demands skill, seamanship, and a strong stomach. With its 31-foot tidal range, the Mersey too can be quite awesome. Throughout this century, ferry boats have crisscrossed the busy river, connecting Liverpool with Birkenhead and Wallasey. The Birkenhead steamer Lancashire of 1899 had 2 sets of 4-cylinder triple expansion engines. Odd-looking vessels, known locally as luggage boats, carried animals and produce and later motorised vehicles. This traffic was all but killed off when the first Mersey Road tunnel opened in 1934, although a luggage boat kept running at Seacombe until 1947. Despite threats of closure, the famous ferry across the Mersey is still hard at work. Some industrial giants like Lever Brothers opted to develop their own facilities. Activity at Bromborough Port before the First World War. Originally named Leinster, the Ulster Prince had been a Mersey regular on the Belfast crossing since 1938. She would be scrapped in 1967, as was the older two-funnelled Ulster Monarch, dating from 1930. At one time the Mersey seemed to be awash with ships. Today, despite the closure of much of the extensive dock system, the new facilities at Seaforth are currently handling more tonnage than in Liverpool's glory days, when it prided itself on being the second port of the empire. Here the Blue Funnel Line steam turbine Pyrrhus enters Gladstone Dock. Built in 1949, this 10,000-tonner would be scrapped in 1972. Ships have long stopped tying up at Blackpool's three piers. Yet 100 years ago, this resort throbbed with steamers bound for such places as Preston, Liverpool, Llandudno and the Isle of Man. Launched on the Clyde in 1895, Greyhound was, like so many of her contemporaries, requisitioned during the war. The ultimate fate of any vessel is fascinating. For example, this one was sold into Turkish waters in 1925. The Birkenhead-built Deerhound, which only appeared at Blackpool between 1901 and 1905, eventually became the property of the Canadian government. Along the coast at Fleetwood, one of the Isle of Man quins negotiates the difficult channel heading towards the Irish Sea. A delightful little ferry still links Fleetwood to Knott End on Sea. In 1956, service was provided by the diesel-powered Calder Vale and Loon Vale. On the right was the steamer Wyresdale. All are now scrapped. Inland to Lake Coniston and the elegant gondola built for the Furness Railway. Owned by the National Trust, this 1859 steamer works regularly during the season and is now the oldest British ship still in service. On the other side of Grizedale Forest, Windermere has its ever-busy chain ferry. Also on the lake are a fleet of former railway steamers, the oldest of which is Tern, built for the Furness Railway in 1891. One of those ports that never quite met early expectations was Silloth. Rare colour film taken in the late 30s of the Clyde-built passenger cargo and cattle steamer Asseroe. For most of her long life she worked to and from Ireland and was scrapped in 1947 after 54 years' service. To Stranraer, the main point of embarkation for Larne in Northern Ireland. The car ferry Darnia dated from 1977. The roll-on, roll-off car ferry Galloway Princess from 1980, whilst the 37,000-ton Ailsa Princess was older, being built in 1971. In 1966, King Orry prepared to leave Ardrossan for the 6-hour crossing to Douglas. The Clyde was once a wonderful hunting ground for those interested in excursion steamers. For example, Talisman of 1935 is seen at Rothsay shortly before her withdrawal. Duchess of Hamilton leaves Loch Ramsar on the Isle of Arran in July 1965. Built by Harland and Wolff in 1932, this oil burner was withdrawn in 1970. Well into the 60s, thousands of Glaswegians still relished a sail down the water. From the decks of the pleasure steamers, they could observe the variety of vessels entering and leaving the Clyde. Glasgow was one of the busiest ports in the country, handling a rich mix of imports and exports. Now these once busy docks are all silent. Exports had included Scotch whisky, textiles and heavy machinery, such as giant steam locomotives. The steam turbine Queen Mary II, built in 1935 for the Caledonian Steam Packet Company, could carry cargo as well as up to 2,000 passengers. One of the most loved paddlers was the Jeannie Deans, built for the LNER in 1931. Capable of carrying nearly 1,500, she was originally coal-fired and had a top speed of 18.5 knots. Further views of Queen Mary II. The St. Columba of 1912 was known as the Wee Cunarder because of her 3 red and black funnels. She made her last sailings in 1957. Many vessels were railway owned and linked Glasgow with both the coastal towns along the Firth of Clyde as well as many of the nearby islands. In the past, the Clyde had also been crossed by numerous ferries, including this one at Renfrew. On Loch Lomond, Maid of the Loch is seen at Balloch Pier. Although laid up for many years, there is hope this fine vessel could be preserved. Already well over 45 years old when filmed, King George V approaches Oban in August 1973. Three years later, the small car ferry Bute is seen at Mallaig. Until withdrawn in 1970, the Loch Fyne of 1931 made a daily return sailing from Gourock to Ardrishay, carrying the mail. The vehicle ferries linking Skye with the railhead at the Kyle of Loch Alsh were replaced by a new road bridge in the mid-80s. When the 4th road bridge was opened in 1964, the heavily used Queen's Ferry passage was closed. Worked latterly by 4 flush-deck paddlers, these had only just been able to handle the growing volume of traffic. In the early 50s, Leith docks were still in full swing. As Newcastle was the regional centre of the northeast, along the banks of the Tyne were miles of factories, shipyards, steel mills and coal loading berths. For many years, the regular vessel on the Shields ferry was the locally built Northumbrian, dating from 1929. This service is still operating, but with much smaller craft. The Ha'penny ferry at Sunderland closed in 1957. This was the third vessel to carry the name Sir Walter Rane. Loading coal at Goole, the highest navigable point on the Humber for ocean-going vessels. Activity now at Alexandra Dock, Hull. This is the 7,000-ton Sunderland-built Harpalice, a tramp ship belonging to J&C Harrison of London. This German-built Blue Star Line vessel carried refrigerated cargoes to and from Australasia. The ferry, which once linked Hull to New Holland, was killed off by the Humber Bridge and the developing motorway system. The Lincoln Castle, seen here in standard BR colours, dated from 1940. This fine paddler now serves as a floating restaurant in Grimsby Docks. To reach the docks at Immingham, workers could travel by tram until 1961, on a line specially built by the Great Central Railway. Once a busy fishing port, today Lowestoft houses several oil rig support vessels like the Britannia Chieftain. Today, Harwich is one of the busiest passenger ports on the east coast, with its regular services to the Hook of Holland. The 17,000-ton car ferry St Nicholas entered service in 1982. Until the late 80s, the Brightlingsea operated on the Cross Harbour ferry to Felixstowe, now one of the most successful container ports in Britain. And so, back to the Thames estuary, with the Medway Queen approaching Clacton. Built in 1924, she was withdrawn in 1963, and after lying derelict for several years, is now being restored. Our nostalgic coastal tour concludes where it began, on the Thames itself. Here it is still possible to occasionally recapture all the former glory of Britain's shipping legacy by boarding one of a handful of preserved ships, like the delightful Kingswear Castle. So much has changed during the past 100 years. For example, Britain is no longer a great shipbuilding nation. Once there have been scores of busy yards, one of the largest being Harland and Wolff at Belfast, birthplace of the White Star liners, including Titanic. Today, this is one of the few yards still open. At Sunderland, which once produced more ships than any other town in the world, nothing now remains. Launched from Doxford's yard in 1954, the 12,000-ton tanker Morganan slips into the weir. Some of the greatest names could be found along the banks of the Clyde. Despite a long rearguard action, all these famous yards have now gone. One notable survivor is Camel Laird's on Merseyside. These scenes were taken 40 years ago as part of a publicity film concentrating on the yard's modern working practices. A brand new repair facility was built adjacent to Laird's in the 1950s. As elsewhere, the investment failed to bring in sufficient business as ship owners shifted to less costly yards in other parts of the world. Today, this site has completely disappeared. During this century, the use of canals for industrial purposes has all but stopped. 100 years ago, bulk goods such as coal were transported miles by barge. However, today's network of canals and waterways form an integral part of the leisure industry. Dwarfing all others was the Manchester Ship Canal. The Big Ditch had been carved out at the end of the 19th century to allow seagoing vessels to travel inland towards Manchester. Near the beginning of their 36-mile journey, vessels bound for Manchester passed beneath the structure supporting the Runcorn Transporter Bridge. Traffic on the canal peaked during the 50s and 60s, with some 5,000 vessels carrying up to 16 million tons. En route, the canal was crossed by bridges and ferries, and ships also had to negotiate several locks. Decline during the 70s and 80s would be swift and dramatic. Today the upper reaches see little traffic, and the once bustling docks, now devoid of ships, form part of Salford Quay's development. Throughout the country, traditional dock systems have all but gone. During the past 30 years, these have dwindled following reduction of Britain's manufacturing base, the decline in heavy industry, changes in cargoes, patterns of trade, and the introduction of containerization. This has reduced the time a vessel needs to stay in port. Today's ship owners demand a swift and reliable turnaround in order to maximize utilization and profits. Increasing mechanization has wiped out scores of quayside jobs. The prolonged dock strikes of the 1960s certainly led many shipping lines to transfer their custom away from Britain. Today, however, our main container ports are thriving and our free ports do excellent business. However, the action-packed old-style docks are nearly all gone. These were often cramped and too confined for today's big monsters. Gone is the need for hundreds of warehouses, cranes, quayside railways, tramp steamers, flotillas of tugs, smoking freighters, and hundreds of men engaged in all manner of labor-intensive activities. When these scenes were filmed, most of the freighters would have been registered here and crewed by UK seamen. Today, many fly under flags of convenience and are crewed by foreign seamen. The government has stated its intention of encouraging more owners to register their vessels in the UK, but only a slight driftback has so far occurred. Few pure shipping lines remain. Often, ship owning is merely one activity for a large international company who has little loyalty to a particular flag. In 1900, Britannia really had ruled the waves. As 2000 approaches, our navy is small, yet despite having fewer ships, it possesses more firepower than it did at the height of the Second World War. This is HMS Invincible. Our lasting memories of this century must include the battle for the Atlantic, when Britain's very survival was threatened. We also remember the one-time world-famous liners, whose very names were once as familiar as today's pop idols. They stood for romance, for power, for luxury, for immigration, and for entertainment, when stars like Cicely Courtnidge and Jack Hulbert seemed to dance their way to New York. We still remember with pride great names like Mauretania, Olympic, Aquitania, Empress of Scotland, Queen Mary, and Queen Elizabeth.